So the Hijaz in my talk mainly we focus about Mecca and Medina, the most two holy cities for Muslims. Also, the Hijaz contains other important cities such as Ta'if and Jeddah and Yanbu', which Yanbu' and Jeddah they are the two ports serving Mecca and Medina. But my talk focus in Mecca and Medina clearly because they played the central role in the intellectual and religious life of the region. So maybe it seems strange to talk about Sufi aspects in the Hijaz today because they are part of the Saudi state, which is founded on the anti-Sufi Wahhabi ideology. But we have to remember that the Saudi state's history does not exceed 1 century. Before that, the Hijaz was for more than 400 years part of the Ottoman Empire, which is known for having Sufi inclination. And Sufism, of course, was much earlier than Ottoman Empire. I will start with this beautiful images, which I think they give us an idea about our perception of the Hijaz and what is the situation was just 1 century earlier. These two pictures in black and white is the same place of Al-Baqi' cemetery, which is the most important cemetery in Islamic history, where many of the Prophet's family and companion and many scholars in the history of the region were buried there. This is how it was at the end of the Ottoman Empire, with a lot of domes and Sufi shrines, and all this was destroyed, and this is what we still have now. And I think this is our perception of the Hijaz now, and this is what I'm trying to represent in my research. So in my talk, I will start with a short historical context of the region. Then I will mention the Ribats and Sufi centers in the history of the Hijaz. Then I will introduce genera of literature, which is very helpful in tracing scholars and Sufis from different parts of the Islamic world to the Hijaz. And then I will use this tool to trace Sufi orders from Indian subcontinent, Egypt, Levant, Yemen, and North Africa to the 17th century Hijaz. And at the end, in the conclusion, I will just present a few ideas about the continuity of Sufi orders in the 18th and 19th century. So the Hashemites Sharif dynasties were the actual rulers of the Hijaz from the 4th, 10th centuries until the beginning of 20th centuries, almost without any interruption, except for less than a decade at the beginning of the 19th century. Hashemite Sharif, they were the actual rulers of the region, but the region itself was under the domination of stronger power. Mainly the Sharif, they accepted this kind of domination because of the scarcity of economic sources in the region. So they needed stronger power to secure the trade and pilgrimage routes and to support the region with almost every economic sources. At the beginning of 10th, 16th centuries, Ottoman and led by Sultan Salim I entered Cairo in 923, 1517. And then the ruler Sharif Barakat II, the ruler of the Hijaz, proclaimed his loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan. And since then, the Hijaz became part of the Ottoman Empire, and it was known as Vilayat of the Hijaz, which extended from the southern border of Syria until the north border of Yemen. At the same time, when the Hijaz became part of the Ottoman Empire, a set of global and local conditions contributed significantly to increase the flow of scholars and students from different parts of Islamic world to the Hijaz. some of them is the rise of the two strong and wealthy empires, Ottomans and Mongols, and their generous donations helped establishing educational institutions and endowments for students and the scholars. At the same time, Ottoman securing the pilgrimage routes increased the number of people who headed to the Ḥijāz. At the same time, when the European navies passed and discovered the Cape of Good Hope and spread the European vessels spread in the Indian Ocean, also the connection between the Ḥijāz and Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia was much stronger, and the flow of scholars and the students between the two regions increased. The stable political situation in the Ḥijāz helped the region to benefit from all these global changes. So the Ḥijāz has been the destination for Muslims performing the pilgrimage to Mecca and visiting the Prophet in Medina from the beginning of Islam. Because proximity to the holy places has always been essential reason to stay in the Ḥijāz. The Ḥijāz was the perfect place for Sufis to meet diverse groups of scholars, and Sufis exchange books, ijāzas, knowledge, attract followers, and spread their orders. From the first century of Islam, there was common houses for poor people who visited the Ḥijāz. These common houses developed later to kind of ribats, and ribat is the term originally refers to dwelling houses in the border of the state for soldiers to live, who protect the borders. But later it became referring to houses who host travelers and poor people from any place in the state, and mainly for Sufis. So ribats appeared in the Ḥijāz from the 4th centuries, and some of them were dedicated for poor people. But at the 6th century, we have some ribats were dedicated especially for Sufis. And we know from the names of the ribats later that most of the ribats were dedicated for Sufis, or at least they had some Sufi activities. When we read about the history of these ribats, we know that there were dhikr, or there were Sufi activities in these ribats. In Ayyubi period, the number of ribats at the 4th century, 4th Hijri, 10th century, there were 11 ribats in Mecca alone. In the Ayyubid period, the number increased to 34 ribats. In the Mamluk period, the number became 80 ribats. And we know that the Sufism was in the Ḥijāz before Ottomans, a long time before Ottomans, but the Ottoman inclination to Sufism increased the place of Sufism in religious life. So we find that in the Ottoman Empire, there were 156 ribats in Mecca alone. And in my study about the Quran, I argued that mostly the ribats in Medina were much more than this number, but we don't have specific studies about ribats in Medina. So before attempting to trace Sufi orders from different parts of Islamic world to the Ḥijāz, I want to introduce a specific genre of literature that appeared almost in the 6th and 7th Hijri centuries, 13 Common Era, where some scholars who were affiliated to different Sufi groups, or who studied with different teachers and sheikhs, they started to collect their isnads in some treatises. These treatises sometimes are dedicated just, for example, to wear the Sufi garment, or for example, for the Sufi dhikr, or for affiliation to some Sufi orders. Here, I just give an example. This printed book in Arabic contains 9 treatises about wearing the Sufi garments. The manuscript here is Ibn Arabi's treatise in Libs al-Khirqa, and this considers one of the early, if not the first treatise in this genre of literature. And this is Claude Addas' edition of Ibn Arabi's and translation to French. So this genre of literature started by some scholars who wanted to list their affiliation to Sufi orders, and in these treatises they mention different Sufi aspects. For example, the receiving the dhikr, or allowing a student to open dhikr seasons, and all different aspects of Sufi practices. They also sometimes, here I just give an example also on another treatise in Libs al-Khirqa from 19th century, but it's a detailed study about different kinds of khirqa, their colors, their internal and external meaning, and the practice, the ritual for transmitting Sufi practices and affiliation to Sufi orders. This genre of literature, it's very clear it was influenced by Hadith tradition, but because the transmission of Hadith, which started by listing the chain of transmission from scholars who collected this Hadith until the Prophet. Later, the transmission started to be for the collection themselves. So instead of listing the transmission of Hadith by Hadith, scholars started to transmit the Hadith collection like Bukhari and Muslim. The same thing happened here. Instead of transmitting affiliation to single Sufi order, scholars started to collect their affiliation in one treatise or in several treatises, and then they transmitted to their students all together. So I will give just one example for those unfamiliar with the Sufi tradition. Here I just give the most famous Naqshbandi golden chain Silsilat al-Dhahab, which extended from Baha'u'ddin Naqshbandi until the Prophet. I selected these images because they are obviously very beautiful, but also because this treatise in transmitting Naqshbandi dhikr from the 19th century, 18th century Ḥijāz, a scholar from Medina is named Muhammad Hayat Sindi, who probably was the teacher of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. So this is just one example of Sufi isnad. If a certain scholar has isnad in this in Naqshbandiya, and he has isnad in Qadiriyya or Rifa'iyya, for example, he will combine all these treatises in one, all these chains in one treatise. This will be much easier for him to transmit to his students. So now I will attempt to trace some Sufi isnads from different parts of Islamic world to the Ḥijāz. In the 10th, 16th century, a Sufi from India named Muhammad Khatir ad-Din, known as Al-Ghawth, wrote, he's the author of the main text in Shattariya order, Al-Jawahir al-Khams. He collected his Sufi isnads, his affiliation to 13 Sufi orders. He collected them in a treatise, he called it Ad-Darajat, and he transmitted the 13 Sufi orders to his students. One of them was Wajih ad-Din al-Kujarati, who in turn transmitted this Sufi order to his students, Sibghatullah, Al-Barruji or Al-Barwaji, Al-Hindi. Sibghatullah will later move to the Ḥijāz, and where he will settle permanently in the Ḥijāz. So I just want to mention the Sufi orders that Al-Ghawth collected. These are the 13 Sufi orders. He mentioned these orders with information about each of them and the isnad of Al-Ghawth from himself through his teachers until the founders of the orders, and from the founders of the order until the Prophet or the companions, are already established, like in the case of Naqshbandiya. Sibghatullah, he was born in western coast of India, and after his study with local scholars, he went to the Ḥijāz to perform the Hajj pilgrimage for the first time at 999. And after a few years, he moved to the Ḥijāz permanently. He wrote several treatises. One of them is Hashia on al-Baydawi's tafsir, and another work entitled Kitab Bab al-Wahda. And he also translated Al-Jawahir al-Khams, the main text, in Shattariya into Arabic. Sibghatullah in the Ḥijāz attracted several students. One of them was Abu Mawahib al-Shinnawi, Ahmad al-Shinnawi. Ahmad al-Shinnawi was a scholar, and he was from scholarly family. His father Ali and his grandfather Abdul Qudus, they were students of the famous Egyptian Sufi Abdul Wahab Sha'rani. And his great grandfather Muhammad al-Shinnawi was a Sha'rani's teacher. So Abu Mawahib Ahmad al-Shinnawi, he studied in Cairo with some famous scholars. Then he moved to live in the Ḥijāz, where he became the main student and the Khalifa of Sibghatullah al-Hindi. So Abu Mawahib received the 13 Sufi orders from his teacher Shinnawi, but he himself also isnads in other Sufi orders through his family, which the isnad go back to his grandfather Muhammad. So these are the two lists that Abu Mawahib Shinnawi's Sufi orders received from his Indian lineage through Sibghatullah al-Hindi, and through Egyptian through his great grandfather Muhammad Shinnawi. We see that 5 of them are common, which means that 3 of the Sufi orders, which are originally from Yemen, from India, were already maybe from the beginning of the 16th century, were already known and spread in Egypt. When exactly this Sufi order reached Egypt, we need to study each person in the chain of transmission to see these scholars or these Sufis, when they lived, where they received their Sufi isnads, if they traveled to the India or they received the isnad through other scholars who came to Egypt. The same thing should be happened also to the Ḥijāz, because I'm presenting a few chains of transmission, but as I will mention later, the Ḥijāz was full of Sufis, and each Sufi had his own chains of transmission. And to know exactly when certain Sufi enters, we have to study the isnad of different groups and different scholars, and to study the life of each one to decide exactly when was the Sufi order arrived to the Ḥijāz. And I'm talking about the Sufi order, not Sufi scholars, because most of the Sufi scholars, they visited the Ḥijāz and spent time. And we know that Ibn Arabi spent a few years in the Ḥijāz, and he documented his life in Mecca. Abdurrahman Jami, he documented his Hajj also. Muhammad Barsa, the Naqshbandi Sufi also, he died in Medina. So I'm talking here about some Sufis who moved and established centers and transmitted the order, not only came to pilgrimage or visited the Ḥijāz. So Al-Shinnawi received 13 Sufi orders from his Indian scholars and 14 from his Egyptian grandfather. And in total, he combined 22 without the repetition. He combined 22 Sufi orders, which he received from his teacher, and now he will transmit to his students. He had several students, but the one who collected his isnad and documented them was Safi ad-Din al-Qushashi. Qushashi also came from a scholarly family. He is originally from Palestine, but his father moved to the Ḥijāz, and studied al-Qushashi, and his father, they studied with the scholars in the Hijaz and Yemen. So Safiuddin al-Qushashi received from his teacher al-Shunawi 22 Sufi orders, and in his books he mentioned his isnad through his family to Palestine or Syria, and his teacher through Yemen, and he added more 5 Sufi orders. So now we have 27 Sufi orders in the Hijaz, came from different directions, mainly India, Syria, Egypt, and Yemen. Safiuddin al-Qushashi had numerous scholars, students, but the most prominent, Ibrahim al-Qurani and Hassan al-Ujaymi. Ibrahim al-Qurani did not write a specific treatise just for his affiliation to Sufi orders, but he wrote his isnads of Sufi orders and practices in different treatises, and his works help us to establish al-Qushashi's isnads, because almost all al-Qurani's isnads were exclusively through al-Qushashi. But the student who listed and the Sufi orders that he received from al-Qushashi and added his own Sufi orders through his own connection with the scholars was Hassan al-Ujaymi. Hassan al-Ujaymi, originally from Yemen, but his family moved to the Hijaz a few centuries before the 17th century. He wrote a treatise to list and to describe the Sufi orders in his time. So when he wrote this treatise, which is known as Risalat al-Ujaymi fi al-Turuq or Risala fi al-Turuq Sufiya, he listed 40 Sufi orders in the Hijaz in the 17th century. He gave a description of these orders and their centers, their sheikhs, their practices, and he listed his isnad in these orders, many through al-Qushashi, some of them, but also through his Yemeni scholars and through some of his scholars from North Africa, mainly Isa al-Tha'alibi and al-Ayyashi, who was a Sufi and a scholar, but traveled a lot, so he had a lot of isnads. So now al-Ujaymi added to the chains the 4 spiritual lineages of Yemen and India, Syria, and Egypt, another direct spiritual lineage to North Africa. Most of the North African Sufi orders were known in Egypt before, but now he has direct connection through his teacher. And we see that in his list, here in the list, this list of 40 orders, the one with the star is the new orders that al-Ujaymi added. We see that some of them, like Zarruqiyya and Jazuliya, it's very clear from the North Africa, and Aidarusiyya and Mashari'iyya is very clear from Yemen. So he received 27 from al-Qushashi, and we expect that he added 13. So we have the list of 40. But actually, the new orders in this book were 17. So that means that there were 4 Sufi orders in al-Qushashi's isnads did not appear in al-Ujaymi. That means that at least 44 Sufi orders were in the Hijaz in the 17th century. While al-Ujaymi listed only 14 Sufi orders, probably he was following the Hadith tradition of collecting 40 Hadith, like al-Arba'in al-Nawawiyya. It became a tradition, and many scholars in different Islamic sciences, not only in Hadith, they started to follow the same rules, like the Arba'in fi Usul al-Din. So maybe al-Ujaymi, he limited his collection of Sufi orders in his time to only 40 Sufi or Sufi orders. At the same time, when at the end of his life, al-Ujaymi wrote another book. In this book, he mentioned his, it's a biography of his teachers. So he listed almost 150 Sufi with whom he studied in the Hijaz, or at least he had connection through correspondence, and he had received ijāzas from them. This book is named Khabaya Zawaya, the Lodge's Secrets. And this book is, I divided this book in 2 sections, because the first part of the book is also dedicated to Sufi centers in the Hijaz. He described 22 Sufi centers in his time. He gave an idea about the sheikhs of these centers, some idea about the history of the orders or the tikiya or the zawiya, with some information about the main scholars in the order. For example, here, I just give some examples. Zawiya al-Ahmadiyya al-Badawiyya. He gave an idea about Ahmed al-Badawi and some of his teachers, some of his students, and some scholars from the Badawiyya order in the Hijaz. In this photo here in the right corner, he said that in Mecca there were 2 zawiyas for Badawiyya, and he gave the name of each sheikh of the zawiya and their activities and their chain of transmission until the Sheikh Ahmed al-Badawi. Also some examples from Tikiya al-Mawlawiyya and Tikiya al-Gulshaniyya. He gave a description of 22 Sufi centers and zawiya in the Hijaz at that time. The second part of the book was dedicated to his Sufi teachers. And as I said, he listed 150 Sufi teacher with whom he studied, and he was in personal connection. Just want to mention that this list is not comprehensive because he listed only his teachers. Some very famous Sufis, but they were in the same generation and they were his colleagues, not his teacher. He did not mention them. I found several names of scholars. For example, Salim al-Basri and Ahmed al-Nakhli and Abu Tahir al-Qurani, the son of Ibrahim al-Qurani. They were all the same generation of al-Ujaymi, and they studied with the same, with many common teachers. But al-Ujaymi did not mention most of these Sufis in his book because this book was only dedicated to his own teachers. So just to have an idea that only one scholar was able to mention 150 Sufis. So if we want to have a better idea about Sufism in the Hijaz, we need to study the thefts and isnads of many of the Sufi scholars. If we have to study the biography of 150 Sufi, at least in the Hijaz, and each of them had his own Sufi isnads, maybe different than what I'm presenting here, but because as I said, I'm presenting here only one chain of transmission from al-Shinnawi to al-Kushashi to al-Qurani and al-Ujaymi. But there were, the Hijaz was full of Sufis, and each one has his own isnads, which extended different direction in the Islamic world. So these two books in the Hijaz, Hassan al-Ujaymi, now he had the spiritual lineage of Sufi tradition in Egypt, in North Africa, in India, in Syria, in Yemen, and they all were combined in the Hijaz in the 17th century. And Hassan al-Ujaymi gave us a very clear idea through his book about the Sufi orders and through his biography of some, which means by some, I said 150 Sufis in that time. What happened later? Al-Ujaymi died at the beginning of 18th century. By the end of the 18th century, Murtada al-Zabidi was interested in isnad. So he wrote several treatises about Sufi isnads, about Libs al-Khirqa, about many Sufi practices. The most important one is Aqd al-Jawhar al-Thamin fi al-Dhikr wa Turuq al-Ilbas wa al-Talqin. In this treatise, al-Zabidi listed 128 Sufi orders with a short description for each of one. But here we have to remember, Zabidi was born in India. He studied in Yemen, in the Hijaz, and in Cairo. So he was able to collect all these Sufi tradition through his connection with the scholars in different parts of Islamic world. While Al-Ujaymi, he never left the Hijaz. Al-Ujaymi, he was describing the Sufi orders in the Hijaz, in the small region of the Hijaz. This is why I think even Al-Zabidi was able to collect more Sufi orders, but I don't think in any specific place there were the number of the Sufi orders or Sufi centers as was in the Hijaz in the 17th century. Almost every scholar in the Hijaz in the 17th century was affiliated to Sufi orders. Here, before moving to Al-Sanusi, we know that at the beginning of 19th century, in 1803 and 1804, the Wahhabi troops led by Saud bin Abd al-Aziz take over the Hijaz for almost 10 years, because after that, Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, he sent his army, they drove the Wahhabi outside of the Hijaz. Also, they destroyed a lot of Sufi centers. In one of the Wahhabi historian, Ibn Bishr, I think, he mentioned that they destroyed almost 80 domes only in Mecca. They were built in the house, some members of the Prophet's house and some companion and Sufis. But Sufism was still strong in the Hijaz even after the occupation of the Wahhabi troops for this short time. We know that Muhammad bin Ali Sanusi, he lived in the Hijaz for a long time, and he was interested also in Sufism. In one source, that's mentioned that only for Sanusiya there were 16 Sufi centers in the Hijaz in the middle of 19th century. Al-Sanusi collected, he was affiliated to many Sufi orders, and in this manuscript photo, he said that he has isnads for more than 70 Sufi orders, but he decided to write a book and only to abridge Al-Ujaymi's text. And I mentioned this image because Al-Sanusi's book, Al-Sabil Al-Ma'in, is printed, but in two editions printed, both of them is missing this important statement that he had isnads of more than 70 Sufi orders. Sanusi also, he had another book in which he listed his Sufi isnad also, but mainly from Al-Sabil Al-Ma'in and from Al-Ujaymi's treatise. So here, Al-Sanusi was after the occupation of the Wahhabi for the first time of the Hijaz. We have more other documents about the presence of the Sufism in the Hijaz. I did not study the Sufism in the Hijaz in the 19th century in details. I just have general information, so I can't give detailed information. But we know that at least we have two books. Shnok, in his book about Mecca in the later period of 19th century, he gave a detailed picture of daily life of the Hijaz, but he was not interested mainly about Sufism. He mentioned that most of the scholars in the Hijaz were describing themselves as Sufis, and they always present themselves as Qadiri or Naqshbandi or Sufis. But he mentioned just a few Sufi orders. But also we have another book which was published in, I think, 1887 by a French scholar and soldier, Le Chatelier, mainly about Sufi order in the Hijaz. But this book was written by a French soldier who was working with the French army, and he wrote this book through interviewing scholars, not scholars, pilgrims who returned from the Hajj, so in Cairo. So his book is, he listed 18 Sufi orders, but mainly through the Egyptian pilgrimage who return to Cairo. So it's not a comprehensive study and not first-hand study, and it was motivated by political reasons, because he was interested mainly about the connection between the Sufi orders in the Ḥijāz and other Sufi orders in some regions under the French colonialism, mainly in Algeria. But at least we have this document about the 18th Sufi orders were still existed in the Ḥijāz at the end of the 19th century. And we know at the beginning of 20th centuries, with the end of the Ottoman Empire and the Arab Revolt by Sharif Hussein, and became part of the Saudis, and then we know the attitude of the Saudi government toward Sufism, because they consider Sufism as a manifestation of polytheism. So this is very quickly survey or idea about some Sufi orders. I have more details, but I think I rushed to present a lot of information. I'm sorry for a lot of names and books and chains. I think I was lucky because now manuscripts, we have more easier access to manuscripts, and I was lucky to collect some manuscripts related to the region, because Al-Ujaymi's treatise about Sufi orders, 40 Sufi orders, was considered missing until just a few years. Most of the studies always refer to Al-Ujaymi's through Al-Sanusi's Al-Salsabil Al-Ma'in. But I was lucky to find 2 copies of this work. And also Al-Ujaymi's Khabaya Zawaya, which I think these 2 books give the best idea about the Sufi life in the Ḥijāz in the 17th century, was published almost 20 years ago, but very commercial edition from 1 manuscript. I was also able to find 4 different copies, and I prepared the critical edition for both text, and hopefully the book will come out soon from Braille. I think I will stop here and I will continue with the discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Naser. That was a whirlwind of a tour you gave us. I wanted to, I have some questions, but I don't want to take away from other people's questions. I'm sure they have so many to ask. So what I'm going to do is basically open up the floor. Now, the way we'll do it, I think to keep things the most sane in terms of an orderly, if you have a question, and if you don't mind typing it in the chat function, I'll then go ahead and read it to Dr. Dumairieh. That'll be the best way to do it. So type your question, and you can do it using the chat. Just send it to me, through a direct message. And as they roll in, I'll curate them, and then the ones that are, the pertinent, I will read them on your behalf. All right. While you do your typing, let me ask that one of the questions that which I've been thinking about for some time, and it's your work that's really gotten me to question some of the assumptions that a lot of us have about the presence of Sufism in Saudi Arabia. And anyone who's been to Saudi Arabia today and has met, as I was alluding to at the beginning of when I was introducing you, different kinds of Sufi groups there. Sometimes we wonder, how do they, in today's climate in the country, how is it that they're allowed to function so freely on one level? Now, is it because there is a lack of a certain kind of metaphysical exposition of Sufi doctrine that's tied to a lot of what passes for Sufism in Saudi Arabia today? I remember being at the house of many of the Balawi Sayyids in Mecca, and they enjoy government patronage probably, or at least they just don't bother them. But it's, you know, there's very little to distinguish what they're doing from pretty much any other Muslim, except with the level of intensity and of course a great familial lineage and this kind of thing. But there's no, you know, a serious Akbarian wild esoteric teachings, at least not explicitly being discussed. So is that some of the reason for why in today's Saudi Arabia you'll see Sufism and it'll be perhaps even supported privately, or is there something else, or are we missing something?
I think there are other people who can answer this question better than me. I don't, you know, Omar, and you know, there is a dissertation in Germany about Sufism in contemporary Saudi.
Yeah.
From my knowledge, I know that most of the Sufi activities in Mecca and Medina and Jeddah mainly, they happen in private houses, and mainly the dhikr, just some kind of dhikr without any doctrinal or philosophical ideas. But I think there are other people who can answer this question better than me. Omar has very close connection, and I think the name.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another friend who wrote a dissertation mainly about Sufism in contemporary Saudi. So mainly as you mentioned, maybe because they don't have this doctrinal aspects of Sufism, mainly some practical dhikr seasons, which were allowed now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. No, that partly does, that does answer kind of, at least just the general curiosity. It's kind of well, what you're saying echoes what my experience has been. Now, okay, so some questions have been rolling in. I'm going to curate. Janos has 2 comments, so I'm going to bring them together. His first.
No, sorry, it is one. I just mistakenly.
Okay. No, I'll put them together. No problem. So he says, "Thank you, Professor Dumairieh, for the amazing talk. How much do we know about the patronage networks that supported Sufi networks in the Ḥijāz, especially in light of probable documentary sources such as the Waqfiyas in the Ottoman Empire?" So he's asking specifically about the material evidence based on waqfs and the support of Sufi networks during the Ottoman period.
I think the Ottoman period is the best period documented because at least even in most of the people, they don't expect, but the Sufi collection in Mecca and in Riyadh and in Medina, they contain a lot of Sufi works. And most of the Sufi works, my study mainly about the isnad, because as you mentioned at the beginning, the Hadith and Sufism were connected in the Ḥijāz in the 17th century, and even in Western academic scholarship, the Ḥijāz was mentioned as the center of Sufism and Hadith flourishing in the 17th centuries. And many scholars talk about the influence of the Ḥijāz in the revival movement in the 18th century and the intellectual and spiritual life in the Southeast Asia through the Al-Haramain network or Al-Haramain circle. But exactly in this period, the works, at least from my research, I was able to collect most of Ibrahim al-Qurani's works, almost 30 of al-Ujaymi's works, al-Barzanji, the students of al-Ujaymi, Ibn Aqila, because most of the scholars, they wrote their isnads in hadith, and most of these works of isnads, they contain isnads in Sufism and Sufi isnads. So if we want to have a better idea, we have to include most of the works of hadith transmission also to extract the isnad of Sufi orders or Sufi practices.
Good, very good, excellent. Okay, so there are a few more coming in. Rashid Chaudhary has asked, when one sheikh could collect over 20 or 40 different isnads, and transmit them to his students, with each generation of sheikhs sometimes transmitting more turuq than the previous generation, was there eventually a centripetal tendency of turuq merging, or were they able to keep their distinct identities?
No, they were distinct, and some sheikhs, they were mainly teaching some specific orders, but they had permission to transmit others. Al-Qushashi, for example, he was mainly Shattari and Naqshbandi, but he had the permission and he had the ijaza to transmit others. So when he transmit these other Sufi orders for anyone who asked for them, he transmit them with their prayers, with their dhikr, with their ritual and everything. When we see that Al-Ujaymi treatise, he has a clear idea about each group and their prayers, and they transmit them. But most of these sheikhs, and this is supposed to be that if a new student arrives to the sheikhs, it's up to the sheikh, maybe depends in the sheikh's visions, what is best for the disciples, what he needs more, which order, which dhikr is better for his state at the beginning of the Sufi way. So, but yes, most of the Sufis, they have very distinct Sufi orders. Sometimes they give the students the dhikr of a specific order. If he wants other dhikr of other order, most of the sheikhs, if they are allowed to transmit other dhikr, they will do that. But most of them, they were active mainly in some specific orders. This is why in the 17th century Hijaz, we know that the Qadiriyya and Shattariya and Naqshbandiyya and Rifa'iyya, some of the Sufi orders, they were more active, more attractive for students. Also, we have, as I mentioned, 44 Sufi orders.
Right.
And just to mention that some of these Sufi orders, we know the meaning of order is the way. So not all these Sufi orders, they had the institutional building or centers. Like, for example, we know that the Hatimiyya order until now was transmitted through the sheikhs of the tariqah, but there was no official tariqah or the center or zawiyah for Hatimiyya or Akbariyya.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's a point that was recently confirmed by Abdul Baqi Miftah in an interview that we did with him, which should be coming out soon in the Ibn Arabic Study Journal. So there are a couple of there are a number of comments and also some questions. So just putting them together. Omar Edebat, who your colleague from McGill, who also wrote a brilliant thesis on the Sadat Alawiyya, Bani Aliwa. He says in response to the question that we had posed earlier, that it's largely political. There's this current shift away from Wahhabism in the Saudi government and more towards Sufism. It's a trend that's seen throughout the Arab world today, he's saying, largely because Sufism is seen as a pacifist alternative. And then he has a question, so I'm going to get to his, and then I see Besnik, who I remember from Istanbul, who has a question too. Yes. So we're going to get to his in a second. Omar's question is, do you have, excuse me, do you have a sense of the scale and how much has been lost and purged in terms of Sufi literature across the Hijaz at the hands of the rising Wahhabi movement?
It's difficult to say that we lost a lot, of course, because when I start to mention, for example, the treatise Al-Darajat of Al-Ghawth, I did not find it. A lot of Shinawi's treatises, I did not find them. I can't say that's due to the Wahhabi presence in the Hijaz at the beginning of 19th century or in the 20th century, because this happened in the history of manuscripts a lot, even in the other regions in the Islamic world. When we see the catalogs of manuscripts, if for example, in Medina, the Jamia al-Islamiyya in Medina, or in Riyadh, or in Mecca, we found hundreds of treatises in Sufism. So I don't think there was organized attempt to destroy the Sufi literature, because we still have most of them, but we lost a lot. We lost a lot. This happened in the Ḥijāz, in other words, in Islamic wars, and at the same time, just for example, Ibrahim al-Qurani said that his teacher al-Qushashi was not interested in collecting his treatises. He said, Ibrahim al-Qurani, he said, he started to write to other scholars in Yemen and in Syria and Egypt and asked them to copy al-Qushashi's treatise and send some copies to him. So this is also another reason some scholars did not, or not scholars or their students did not reserve the work of their teachers.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, thank you. Now, Besnik has a question, and by the way, he also, as Naser was mentioning, he himself has written a dissertation on Sufism in contemporary Saudi Arabia, and I remember having some exchanges with Besnik in Istanbul several years ago. So I'm happy to see that you've continued going down this route, and I see that you have a question as well. And this is his question. He says, thank you very much for your presentation. One, were there debates among different Sufi orders about the legacy of Ibn Arabi? Since you mentioned the Aydurusiya Ba'alawis, who are skeptical of the teachings of Ibn Arabi. So that's the first question. And the second, why don't you answer the first one, and then I'll pose the second one. So basically, you know, what were the debates, if any, among Sufis?
If we talk about the period I mentioned about the 17th century, 18th century, and maybe 19th century before the contemporary Saudi state, Ibn Arabi was very accepted. And in my dissertation, in my book, I argued that Ibn Arabi's ideas became the main Islamic theology in the Ḥijāz. And most of the intellectual thought in the Ḥijāz was influenced by Ibn Arabi in the 17th century. So no, there was no objections, and even most of the controversial ideas which were rejected by some Sufis, like the faith of pharaohs or the end of hellfires in the Judgment Day, were accepted in the Ḥijāz. And Al-Barzanji, he wrote a treatise to defend the idea of faith of pharaohs. Also, a lot of scholars, even Akbarian scholars, in Sha'ranis, with the idea that this idea is interpolated in Ibn Arabi's works, or even in Ottoman Empire, some Sufi Akbarian Sufis, they rejected some ideas, but in the Ḥijāz, most of the scholars, they accepted most of the Akbarian Sufis without any questioning, and Ibn Arabi. I have some stories that scholars were reading Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah in the Haram in Mecca and Medina.
Yeah, which would be very fitting, right? Because especially for the Futuhat, he wrote it. He wrote it. Right? It came in Mecca. So good. So the second question of Besnik's second question is, he says, Siraj Hendricks described Meccan Sufism as a melting pot of turuq, which made use of different names of turuq unnecessary. Do you think that was true in the period you are looking into?
I think most of the Sufi orders, some Sufi orders, they just branches from other Sufi orders. So we will very easily find a lot of common aspects in all Sufi orders. And Al-Hasan Abdullah al-Ayyashi, Abu Salim al-Ayyashi in the Ḥijāz, when some scholars, they tried to introduce him to Naqshbandiyya, and when he studied the Naqshbandiyya, he said he did not find a lot of differences between Naqshbandiyya and Shadhiliyya, because the Shadhiliyya from North Africa, and they found a lot of common things. And most of the Sufis, I think they attempted to find the common aspects, and to keep most of the Sufi within the accepted Quranic and Hadith studies. But there was very clear idea about the distinct aspect of each Sufi order. So Jamie, when he mentioned sometimes, he mentioned even the dress of specific Sufi and their ritual for a specific kind of dhikr or for affiliation to the order. So it was, they were distinct, but maybe the idea that some sheikhs, they were allowed to practice or affiliate students for different Sufi orders, give this idea that most of the scholars, they don't have a clear idea about the distinction. But I think from the documents, which at least Kushashi and the Qurani and Al-Ujaimi, everything was very clear about the origin and the principles and the practices of each Sufi order.
Very good. Thank you. That's good. Your answers are very detailed. I like that. Masood Taj, who's one of the he's one of our board members, distinguished board members of the Carlton Center for the Study of Islam. He thanks you, and he has a comment here. And going back to the earlier question on patronage, he says that much of the Indian patronage was royal, the Mughals and the Nizams. For instance, during the Mughal period, the Emperor Akbar's he was the commander. Emperor Akbar's Amir Hajj, commander of the pilgrimage, was Sultan Khaja Naqshband Abdul Azim. And there were also Indian Sufi lodges in Konya, he says, Bursa, Antakya, and Aleppo, and Jerusalem, Cairo, which were not merely way stations on the way to main lodges in the Ḥijāz. So that's something to do with Indian presence.
Yeah, I think that the most important supporting empire for the Ḥijāz in the 16th and 17th century was the Mughal. Even Awliya Jalabi, the Ottoman travelers who was in the 17th century in the Ḥijāz, he said that in spite of all the huge donations from the Waqf system in the Ottomans, the Ḥijāz still received more from the Mughal and from the India. And this is why when we see the names of Ribats in the Ḥijāz at that period, we will find a lot of names, very clear Indian names from Al-Kujarati or from other names. So most of these, and in my book, I mentioned the Mughal Empire and their generous donation to the Ḥijāz, which was the biggest donors at that time.
Right. And it wasn't just in Hadith. You're saying it was in disciplines like Sufism and.
I was talking about in general, the support of Mughal and Indian scholars who established a lot of Sufi centers and ribats in the Ḥijāz. But if there is another aspect of the question, sorry, I did not.
No. I was just seeking clarification by myself. No, thank you.
Okay.
I lost. I wasn't following what you were saying, but that's because I got distracted with some of these questions here. But no, that's an excellent point, and I think again it really makes us wonder, what's happening in the Muslim world today, with all of these different just the fragmentation intellectually speaking, and and then that then plays out in places like North America and in Europe and other diasporic Muslim communities, and everything seems so much more fluid in the good old days between Iran and of course the Mughal Empire, and then in the Ḥijāz, as you've demonstrated so well, and so on and so forth. So there's a certain dynamism that's kind of been lost, isn't there? Faisal Shaheen who's in political science from Toronto Metro University, he says, salams to everybody, an excellent presentation. Any thoughts? He asks, any thoughts on the influence and even perseverance, of Sufi orders on local governance in the Ḥijāz? For example, their positions in networks of administration and in services such as the distribution of zakat.
Yes, yes, of course. Yeah. Since they were very influential, most of the sharifs and rulers of the Ḥijāz were, they seek to be close to some Sufi sheikhs who had strong influence on people. And most of the donation, when they came to the Hijaz, most of the sharifs of Mecca, they were very careful to give attention to most of the Sufis, especially those influenced ones in the Hijaz. And many of the Sufi sheikhs at that time, they were very close. I think when we talk about the 17th century Hijaz, almost Mecca and Medina, it's close to villages if we compare them to our days. In some studies, the population of Mecca almost estimated 4,000 to 6,000 persons. So the ruler and all the people, I think, and mostly Sufis, they all know each other, and they know who has the influence in the society. And most of even the qadis and muftis and all the official position were also affiliated to Sufi orders.
Yeah. Yes. Very good. Thank you. Let's see here. Are there any other? There are no more questions have come in. We managed to get through that entire batch, which is good. If any of you have any questions, we have time. We can field more of them for you. If not, then maybe I can ask you one in the meantime. Naser, you may have alluded to it in your lecture, but I remember reading in your study that there was a specific number that you mentioned. You spoke of over 40 ribats in Medina. I think that was the number. If I'm not mistaken, in somewhere in one of your writings, perhaps in your book, I read something to the effect that there were also common khalwa cells amongst the turuq outside of the Prophet's tomb in Medina.
Yes.
So can you say more about that?
Yes, I expect, I have some stories, but I expect most of the zawiyas, they have some isolated place for khalwa, but maybe the what you mentioned, because what I wrote in the book about Ibrahim al-Qurani when he arrived to the Hijaz, and his teacher al-Qushashi, he asked him to enter the khalwa for 40 days. It was in the al-Qushashi Zawiya close to the Prophet's mosque. And I expect most of the Sufi centers and Zawiyas, maybe they have this kind of khalwa, because we have a lot of, when I studied the biography of most of these scholars, al-Ujaymi or al-Qurani or Barzanji, they always mention that they enter the khalwa for 40 days or every year for a few days. So I think it was common practices to have khalwa connected to any kind of Sufi ribats or zawiya.
And specifically outside of the Prophet's tomb in the Haram.
Outside of the Prophet's tomb, I know that some scholars, mainly Qushashi, he mentioned that he was used to write some of his works or teach or transmit some in students. Mainly they select the place because it's close to the closest place to the Prophet.
Yeah, that's fascinating. If you just compare the landscape today to what it would have looked like back then, that was really surprising when I read that, just because I never thought of it that way. We have all these zawiyas right outside of the Prophet's tomb. Okay, there's another question that's come in from Ali Hamoud. He has two questions, and I guess he's diligently writing them down because the first one has come. What were the key texts studied in Sufi circles? I guess in the reference being in the Hijaz, of course.
Most of Ibn Arabi's texts were in the Hijaz. Most of his school, like Al-Qunawi and other, they were in the Hijaz. But for students in Sufism, each student will study different things, depends on his level in the Sufi way. the Sufi path. But I know that, for example, the Shattariya order, they have the main text of Al-Ghawth, Al-Jawahir al-Khams, even it's complicated text, but Al-Qushashi commented, Al-Shinnawi commented 2 commentaries on this text. And it seems it was influential in that time, because Al-Ujaymi and Ibrahim Khurani and Al-Qushashi, they all cited a lot from this text. From other orders, I think every order has its own tradition. Many of the Sufis, they used to introduce people through some common text like Dalail al-Khayrat, or some main text for Sufis, and mainly some Sufis from who came from India, for example, they wrote to explain Naqshbandiya order to people in the Hijaz, especially because there was a conflict between the traditional Naqshbandiya and Mujaddidiya. So we have also a few texts written in the Hijaz, mainly to explain the Naqshbandiya practices and dhikr. This, I mentioned one of them here, but also we know that one of the main texts also we can see that Burhan Buri's text was very popular in Medina and in Southeast Asia and in India, and also Nabilsi commented in the same text. Some texts, they were written for the beginner students, and some texts like Jawahir al-Khams, I think is only was for advanced students.
Very good, thank you. All right, the second question from Ali is, what was the nature of Sufi Shia relations in the Hijaz during this period?
The relation was not positive at all, mainly because of the Hijaz was part of the Ottoman Empire, and at that time there was the war between Safavid and Ottomans. I remember once some Shi'i from the Medina, from the Nakhawla tribes in Medina, they sent to some Shi'i people in Iran and said, you are crossing the Prophet's companion, and we are paying the price here in the Hijaz, because now we are not allowed to do anything related to Shi'ism here. And we have some of the Shi'i scholars, they actually left the Hijaz. At least we know that Muhammad Amin Astrabadi and some scholars who were in the Hijaz, they left to India at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you right. The Safavid Ottoman tensions were, that's key. That's very key for just the presentation of, or the relationship between Sufism and Shiism in that particular region is fraught, as it was in the Safavid period, right? The same groups kind of vying with one another in Safavid contexts amidst Shia legitimacy on the one hand, and then of course the government's patronage, and then increased Akbarian Akbarianization, if you like, of Sufi philosophical teachings created some very, very interesting discussions. It's amazing how influential Ibn Arabi's been just throughout the Muslim world. Good. Now there are other questions coming in. I hope, Naser, you're not tired.
No, it's
You're
okay.
handling this really well, despite the fact that, by the way, Naser is doing this with a cold. He had a throat problem. So okay, so Faisal, who asked a question earlier, there's a comment that he wanted to make, if there's time, and there is, so I'll share it. He thanks you again for your timely talk, and he mentions that part of his own research interests focus on coalitions of interest across growing urban centers in the Muslim world and the services that such groups provide. In contrast to national posts, local government positions are poorly paid and yet closest to the poor, which makes one wonder if these marginalized spaces present an opportunity for Sufi orders to assert themselves and provide much needed support in service, delivery, extension to the informal sector and other racialized groups. And I think you'd answered his question. So this is kind of like the background to his thinking on that, which is interesting. Ali, thanks you. And that's the last of the questions that have come in. Let's see if there are no others. I also have a question. Yeah, I told you I'd have a few, so it's good. We're kind of interspersing them. And this is my last one, I promise. You alluded to Abdul Karim Jili's Insan al-Kamil in your work. And I've seen in many Sunni Arab contexts, especially from the 16th, 17th century onwards, that becomes kind of like, his Insan al-Kamil becomes, even though it's not necessarily representative of the mainstream school of Ibn Arabi, it's still nevertheless very popular and seen as kind of a continuation of Akbarian teachings. And it was read extensively, as we know, right into the 20th century in many Arab countries. In your experience, how influential was Jili's Insan al-Kamil in the Hijaz at that time? Because I suspect, I think you may have, either you wrote about this explicitly or you indicated this in your book, that that might, the fame of that particular text in the different Arab countries may have spread because of its use in the Hijaz.
I think what Dr. Shetix wrote about Ibn Arabi's and the commentary on Ibn Arabi better than me. But that's the philosophized Akbarian tradition with al-Qunawi and al-Janadi and Qaisari. And he mentioned Shetix in one of his studies that al-Insan al-Kamil was very distinct and very specific Akbarian understanding. And maybe this is the reason why some people were preferred more al-Insan al-Kamil. I think it should, I don't have a specific answer about the influence in the Hijaz, but since al-Jili was very influential in Yemen, and Yemeni scholars in the Hijaz were maybe the most influential scholars, I think there will be very strong connection. I have, but it's not very clear idea. I know that in some studies about the Yemen in the 11th and 17th centuries, Abdul Karim al-Jili or the presence was very strong in Yemen. But I can't give you now a clear answer. Maybe if you want, I can check again and see, but I think this is why some of the Akbarian ideas or commentators were more accepted than others, because they were less philosophized. But in the Hijaz, most of the scholars influenced by al-Qurani, mainly because he was almost a philosopher. They were more inclined to al-Qunawi and philosophized Akbarian ideas more than the only spiritual interpretation of Ibn Arabi. Just if you compare between al-Wujud al-Haq of al-Nablsi and what al-Qurani or al-Barzanji wrote, you will find the huge difference between the philosophical and theological aspects and profound in al-Qurani and al-Barzanji, while al-Nablsi was writing for more general people, and this is why he was accepted more than most of the scholars in the Hijaz.
No, thank you. That does shed a lot of light on that question. That does, because you're right, Jili's perspective, it's so number one, in such a short text, comparatively speaking, and it's the language is, it's much more accessible, right? And then with Ibrahim Qurani, you're getting that heavy hitting wujud metaphysics and Asharite kalam and everything in one, really neat package. I remember from your presentation just how sophisticated and how nuanced his understanding was. It was kind of like a new level of a theologization of Akbarian teachings in a way that had not been done before, which was really remarkable just to read, this about this, because we've seen the name Qurani here in scholarship and but never such an in-depth study. And so I really do hope that it receives the attention that it deserves, and I'm sure it will. Samir Akhtar has a question. He says that at the beginning of your lecture, I believe there was a reference to a certain Naqshbandi Sheikh who was mentioned as the Sheikh of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. May you elaborate on that relationship?
Yes, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab studied in the Ḥijāz for a short period, but we know only two of his teachers. One of them, Muhammad bin Hayat al-Sindi, who was a Sufi, the scholar of Hadith, but maybe Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab studied Hadith with him. But the treatise which I mentioned is Naqshbandi Dhikr, but also Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi, he wrote a commentary on Ibn Ata'illah al-Hikam, and it's published, his commentary, and he wrote several works in theology and Sufism, and he was mentioned in many Wahhabi literature. That's one of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab teachers in Medina.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Let's see, are there any other last questions as we wrap up here? Give Naser Dumairieh, Dr. Dumairieh's vocal cords a break. All right, we'll take the silence as acquiescence. Oh, there is one. Omar says thank you for an enlightening talk as always. So Omar is thanking you, and we all thank you very much, Dr. Dumairieh, for spending your evening with us and taking us through this really complex historical dimension of Sufism in this what's turning out to be a much more complicated period than people have heretofore understood, and you really helped shed a lot of light on that. So I thank you very much, and on behalf of myself, the Carl.
Thank you, Dr. Rustam. Thank you for this invitation, and I'm sorry, I know I speak very fast, and I was rushed because when I wrote my presentation, it was almost 20 pages. I need 2 hours, so I decided just to present the main ideas and leave the rest for the discussion. Thank you for your invitation, and I wish that Omar and Besnik also can continue this aspects of the Sufism in the Ḥijāz, because they are also better experts in the topic, in many, especially in the 20th centuries. And
well, you know what I think should happen is yourself, Besnik, Omar, and others, you guys should all team up, and there should be an edited volume or something on this, because this is it's topics like this which are not only fascinating for people who are interested in the history of Sufism, but because it has so many contemporary resonances, and that would really be, the three of you would be a phenomenal team, I think. And the good Omar saying he's for it. Besnik is he would love to. But okay. Now no, really, it's I mean this each of you have very distinct sets of expertise, and I'll just thinking about the contemporary relevance of Sufism, in Saudi Arabia, for those of us who spend time there, it's not surprising to hear that there are certain currents, and maybe they're not always so public, but a lot of people, their interaction with these places, they don't have the specialized training and ability to spend time, in the Ḥijāz. So they'll read secondary accounts, or they'll hear things, or they'll read Michael Sugic's book, Harun Sugic's book, Signs on the Horizons, half of which, or a little less than half of which, it recounts his time that he spent with different sheikhs, mostly Yemenis, mostly Ba'alawi sheikhs, who were at that time living in Mecca, in Medina, in Jeddah, places like this. And it's a remarkable account, and people sometimes wonder, and then they definitely have asked questions like, what's the history of Sufism in the Ḥijāz? And I think each of you coming together, you can really, these are different pieces of a puzzle that it has not been presented in its complete form as of yet. But I think that this collaborative work amongst the three of you and others, I think it can do a huge service for all of us. Thank you very much for listening, all of
Thank you, Dr. Rostam, and
Thank
for
you.
all other colleagues and friends.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have yourselves all a wonderful evening. I would be remiss to remind you that the Carleton Center for the Study of Islam, we've teamed up with the University of Cincinnati, and with through the generous funding of the Templeton Foundation, we have a global philosophy of religion conference coming up, a 3-day event. It's online, and that'll be the end of June, convened by myself and Professor Muhammad Farouk. And that explores contemporary Muslim philosophical responses to the pandemic and evil and suffering. So it's not, Muslim historical discussions about evil or reflections on it based on the views of authors from the past, but rather contemporary Islamic philosophical reflections, of course, in conversation with the masters of the past, and responses, contemporary Islamic philosophical, theological, mystical, and so on and so forth, the views of the relationship between evil, suffering, the so-called silence of God, which is a meaningless term in Islamic theology, and the idea of discovering the divine intent, and also the whole question of the relationship between the divine and the human, but seen from the perspective of human resilience and human betterment. So we're going to convene that conference. The details are available on the Carleton Center for the Study of Islam website, and we hope to see all of you there in our future events as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dumairieh.